Hey everyone. This is chapter 2 of Svetozar Stojanović's Between Ideals and Reality, a critique of socialism and its future, translated by Gerson S. Scher. Chapter 2 is titled The Dialectic of Alienation and the Utopia of De-alienation. Section 1. Is there any sense in writing more about alienation after so many books and articles? The rehabilitation of Marx's concept of alienation has characterized the contemporary renaissance of Marxism and Marxology. Quote, alienation has even become part of the official ideological political jargon in Yugoslavia. The time when our philosophers had to struggle for the acceptance of this idea is past. In fact, according to all indications, we shall soon have to resist its inflation. In order to attempt any further progress with respect to the Marxist theory of alienation, we must first give a brief account of what has been accomplished thus far. First, a coherent theoretical outline had to be fashioned out of Marx's scattered fragments on alienation. On the whole, I think that this task of creative interpretation of Marx has been successfully completed. Much has also been done in applying his ideas to the critique of the contemporary scene. New manifestations and forms of alienation have been identified. For the time being, we will leave problems of application and return to problems of theory. Two different approaches are possible. First, we could simply proceed from the theoretical outline derived from the creative interpretation of Marx, and thereby construct a theory of alienation. Alternatively, we might make certain preliminary corrections in this outline. A theoretical apparatus constructed on the basis of either approach could be used to subject social practice once again to critical investigation. There is no need to go into a detailed reconstruction of Marx's conceptual framework, since this has already been done in large part by others. I shall simply cite three distinguished Yugoslav Marxists who, in the passages that follow, interpret Marx's conception of alienation quite adequately. There are others as well, but our purpose here is not of an informative, much less a bibliographical nature. Gajo Petrović. Quote, but all these kinds of forms of alienations are in the last analysis one. They are only different forms or aspects of man's self-alienation, different forms of the alienation of man from his human, quote, essence, or, quote, nature, from his humanity. The self-alienated man is a man who really is not a man who does not realize his historically created human possibilities. A non-alienated man, on the contrary, would be a man who really is a man who fulfills himself as a free creative being of praxis, end quote. Petrović. And further, quote, one way to specify and clarify the inequality of the two parts into which a self-alienated self is split is to describe self-alienation as a split between man's real, quote, nature, or, quote, essence, and his factual properties, or, quote, existence. The self-alienated man, in such a case, is a man who in fact is not what he is in essence. A man whose actual existence does not correspond to his human essence, end quote. Petrović. And Vojislav Milić says, quote, alienation, according to Marx, is man's loss of or his inability to realize certain of his essential human characteristics, or in general all those characteristics which are peculiar to man as a natural historical being. Marx calls the ensemble of these specifically human characteristics of man his generic being. End quote. Vojislav Milić. That's probably how you say his name. And Mihailo Marković says, quote, to be alienated means in general not to be what man could and ought to be, a free, creative, fully developed, socialized being. End quote. Alienation for Marx is the contradiction between man's essence and his existence. Man often alternates the terms, quote, generic being and, quote, human nature with that of, quote, essence. Further study has demonstrated that Marx's, quote, essence combines in its own peculiar way both cognitive and normative content. Of course, there is another much more common, purely cognitive sense of, quote, essence, i.e. the ensemble of invariable, universal, and necessary properties of a given class of entities. Many have misunderstood Marx and have criticized Marx unsuccessfully because they have read this latter sense of, quote, essence and into his text on alienation. One must also remember that when Marx spoke of man's essence, Marx had in mind a dynamic, not static structure composed of certain potentials which man has not realized, either in full or in part. These essential possibilities, in contrast to their opposites, ought to be realized by man. And although Marx was not systematic in this respect, we can safely name a few of them, such as freedom, creativity, universality, and sociability. Marx did not include any contrary tendencies in man's essence. Thus, quote, essence for Marx was a value selective as well as cognitive term. In Marx's thought, alienation is a general philosophical concept. Alienation, therefore, transcends the individual fields of social life and the individual sciences which study them, such as economics, sociology, political science, history, psychology, and social anthropology. Marx did much more work on the identification of the manifestations of alienation than on the conceptual arrangement of his understanding of the subject. Marx is primarily interested in those forms of socioeconomic organization directed against the essential potentials of man, and concludes that what he was studying was class society in all its aspects. Since man's entire life is centered on the production of material goods, Marx looked for the primary forms of alienation in labor. Alienated labor is, for Marx, the source of other forms of alienation, such as politics and the state, religion, alienated consciousness, alienated needs, and alienated senses. Section 2. Alienation and de-alienation constitute the most general synthetic critical categories of Marx's humanistic theory. In fact, quote, alienated man is for Marx the same as unhumanized, or, quote, insufficiently humanized, unquote, man, while, quote, de-alienated, end quote, man is equivalent to humanized man. But as in life, so in philosophy, these terms are clearer and more common than, quote, alienated and, quote, de-alienated. It is much more natural to say that a person is not humanized, that he has not realized his essential human possibilities, than to say that he is alienated from them. According to common linguistic usage, an entity is alienated from another entity, but not from its own possibilities. On the other hand, the term, quote, alienation suggests that man had previously been in an opposite, non-alienated state. But this would certainly not be in the spirit of Marx's understanding of pre-class society, although it might be in keeping with some of Engels' romantic illusions about it. Of course, philosophy does not have to concede the advantages of ordinary modes of expression. Still, one always has to ask what it achieves thereby and what it loses. In the case of alienation, no one has indicated the gains that would justify the losses. In addition to those mentioned above, there are other losses that are far more important, as these losses are not of a terminological nature. Students of Marx's work have asserted that when Marx spoke of alienation, Marx was not thinking about abstract possibilities, but rather about man's historically given possibilities. But even interpreted in this way, Marx's concept of alienation raises the following serious difficulty. We could not say of slaves, for instance, that they were alienated from their possibility to be free, for they did not have such a possibility. We could not say of slaves, for instance, that they were alienated from their possibility to be free, for they did not have such a possibility. Still, slaves for Marx were in no way unalienated. Of course, the existence of free citizens shows that at the same time other people possessed and had realized the possibility to be free. But what sense would it make to say that slaves were alienated from other people's possibilities? If free citizens embody the historically possible optimum of humanization, then we need simply say that slaves fell below that optimum. This difficulty does not arise if we speak of slaves simply as unhumanized men, for then the judgment of whether slaves are unhumanized is separate from that of whether they possess the possibility to become humanized free. However, to say that slaves are alienated, unfree, is the same as to say they have not realized their human possibility, the possibility to be free. Nor is Marx's concept of human essence, which is the main component of Marx's concept of alienation, any more adequate, not in what it includes, but rather in what it excludes. Marx left some observations of value to philosophical anthropologists on the essential potentials of man. Still, Marx's rather narrow, value-selective notion of essence made it impossible for Marx to include the opposite, no less important set of human potentials as well. Marx himself occasionally abandoned this concept of essence and approached a more inclusive cognitive concept of essence. For example, in the sixth thesis on Feuerbach, in which he wrote that human essence is the totality of social relations. In fact, man's essence includes, for example, destructiveness and not solely creativity, as it seemed to Marx. One can safely say that man is condemned to this duality, to this opposition of human and inhuman potentials. The contradiction between essence, in Marx's sense, and existence belongs to the essence of man. Only gods and non-human beings are complete. Only in their case do essential possibilities and existence coincide. In the case of the former, because of their perfection. In the case of the latter, because of complete predetermination. In contrast with Marx's concepts of, quote, alienation and, quote, de-alienation, the concepts of, quote, dehumanization and, quote, humanization and, quote, do not require us to narrow man's, quote, essence to include solely his human potentials. Section 3. On the whole, Marx was concerned with a more detailed anticipation of communism in his earlier works, particularly in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the German ideology, and the Communist Manifesto. Of his later works, mention should be made primarily of the critique of the Gotha program. In his writings on communism, Marx always firmly opposed the construction of utopias, devoting an entire section of the manifesto to criticism of various utopian conceptions of socialism. Marx strongly emphasized that he was not giving any Comtean recipes for the cookshops of the future. Marx often warned that the question is not one of bringing a utopian system to life, but rather one of conscious preparation in the historical process of revolutionary social transformation. Marx undoubtedly was one of the most uncompromising dialecticians in the history of human thought. However, turning from the past and present to the future, Marx did abandon the dialectic at times. One occasionally senses a tension in his vision of communism between the dialectical inclination and a utopia of definitive de-alienation. While the dialectic led Marx to relativize his limitless hope, led him to absolutize communism as his historical critical perspective. Marx, the dialectician, explicitly denied that communism is the end or goal of history. Quote, communism is the phase of negation of the negation and is consequently, for the next stage of historical development, a real and necessary factor in the emancipation and rehabilitation of man. Communism is the necessary form and the active principle of the immediate future, but communism is not itself the aim of human development, the final form of human society, end quote. Marx. There are other similar passages. Here I would only mention Marx's thesis that communism will be the beginning of mankind's real history. Such passages are quoted by those who firmly deny that Marx ever treated communism in an undialectical fashion. Footnote. See, for example, V. Venable, Human Nature, the Marxian View. And Demerit Fritzhand's The Ethical Thought of the Young Marx, published in Warsaw in 1961, and footnote. However, Marx occasionally, in his later works as well as in earlier ones, described communism as a society in which all basic contradictions would be extinguished, even the contradiction between human essence and existence. This is not hard to show. Quote, communism is the positive abolition of private property, of human self-alienation, and thus the real appropriation of human nature through and for man. Communism is, therefore, the return of man himself as a social, i.e. really human being, a complete and conscious return which assimilates all the wealth of previous development. Communism as a fully developed naturalism is humanism, and as a fully developed humanism is naturalism. Communism is the definitive resolution of the antagonism between man and nature and between man and man. Communism is the true solution of the conflict between existence and essence, between the objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. Communism is the solution of the riddle of history and knows itself to be the solution of the riddle of history. The positive supersession of private property as the appropriation of human life is therefore the positive supersession of all alienation and the return of man from religion, the family, the state, etc., to his human, i.e. social life, end quote. Marx, quote, the supersession of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of human qualities and senses. The supersession of private property is therefore the complete emancipation of the human qualities and senses, end quote. Marx. Quote, he, bracket, Max Stirner, in bracket, thinks that in communist society one can speak of, quote, duties and, quote, interest about two complementary sides of an opposition which pertains solely to bourgeois society, end quote. Marx, German ideology. Quote, under human conditions, however, the punishment will really be nothing other than the judgment of the wrongdoer about himself. One will not try to persuade him that external coercion imposed upon him by others is compulsion which he has imposed upon himself. Rather, he will find in others his natural savior from the punishment which he has imposed upon himself, i.e. the relation will be just the reverse, end quote. Marx, The Holy Family. Marx wrote the following about production in communism. Quote, let us say that we produce as human beings. In that case, 1, I would objectify my individuality, my particular characteristics in my production. And therefore I would also, in the course of my activity, take pleasure in my individual expression of life and derive personal happiness from observing the object of my labor. And furthermore, I would know my personality as an objectified, sensibly visible power, my personality as an objectified, sensually visible power, and therefore ennobled beyond all doubt. 2, I would have immediate pleasure in your enjoyment or use of my product, aware of the fact that by means of my labor I have satisfied a human need, thus that I have objectified human essence, and therefore that I have created an object which corresponds to the needs of another human being. 3, I would sense myself as having been the mediator between you and the human species, knowing that you are conscious of the fact that I represent a complement of your being and a necessary part of yourself, and therefore I would know that I have affirmed myself in your thoughts as well as in your love. 4, I would know that I, through my own individual expression, have provided the conditions for your expression of life. and accordingly that in my individual activity I have directly affirmed and realized my true essence, my human and social essence, end quote. Marx. In the concluding chapter of this book, there will be occasion to discuss the utopian element in Marx's sketch of communist distribution of social production. Other aspects of his thought which sound utopian include some of his rather well-known passages about the total personality, the coincidence of the division of labor with individual inclinations, the complete control of the social processes on the part of associated individuals in communism, and so on. The utopia of complete and definitive de-alienation goes hand in hand with Marx's excessively deterministic propensities, which we shall discuss in Chapter 7. The communist future of humanity is ensured by the inexorable laws of historical development. But while it is easy to observe tensions in a conceptual framework, it is much more difficult and important to establish how such tensions arise. Marx's vacillation between the dialectic and his inclinations to absolutize communism can be explained in terms of the following factors: 1. Theoretical, 2. Sociopolitical, and 3. Psychological. Hegel's absolutist dialectic left a greater mark upon Marx than might be supposed if one were to proceed solely from the fact that Marx himself criticized Hegel on the basis of the incompatibility of his dialectical method with his system. As with the Hegelian absolute, so in Marx's communism all basic contradictions are reconciled. The tradition of the Enlightenment, with Enlightenment's exaggerated rationalism of evolutionism and optimism, also had a significant influence on Marx. This was the source of Marx's unlimited faith in man and man's social, scientific, and technical progress. The second and third factors are closely interrelated. As a radical critic not only of one society but of all previous history as prehistory, Marx was psychologically compelled to be predisposed to absolutize his own perspective from time to time. At certain moments, Marx needed a terra firma, a sort of firm Archimedes point. It is difficult for a thinker to summon people to the most revolutionary act in history while at the same time informing them that their achievement will only be relative. Man has a need to idealize that society for the creation of which he must expend extraordinary effort and sacrifice. This absolutization of communism had negative as well as positive effects. Faith in the ability of the perfect goals may help one to preserve the struggle for ambitious, albeit relative goals, but woe to them who struggle with unlimited hope. How, after all, that had befallen the revolution and himself personally, did a Trotsky feel, who had once dreamed about communist man in these terms, quote, "Man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic," end quote. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Absolutization of the communist future engenders exaggerated expectations from socialism too, as the, quote, transition period, end quote. Didn't the Bolsheviks try simply to do away with money, legal marriage, and the church in a flush of revolutionary ecstasy? It should be pointed out that Marx's absolutization of communism does not have an ideological character. Ideology always absolutes a particular group perspective, as in the case of the Apologia for Capitalism, in which existing society is presented as the expression of real human nature and the realization of the natural rights of man. Marx's vision of communism, however, absolutizes a universal humanistic rather than a particularistic perspective. When the dialectic is taken to such extremes that the transformation from a class to a non-class society is seen as an absolute transformation, the dialectic becomes self-defeating, as it foresees a society in which its basic principle, the struggle of opposites, will no longer operate. If one believes in the possibility of the complete and definitive elimination of the inhuman side of man, there will then be no room left for further social development. A philosopher cannot remain faithful to the dialectic of history unless that philosopher respects the dialectic of human nature. Marxist progressivism shares the same fate as his dialectic as a result of his occasional absolutization of communism. An unmeasured optimism which believes in the possibility of final transcendence of the contradiction between human essence and existence is self-defeating, for it leaves no room for further humanization and progress. A perfect idea is really deficient because, as Hegel said, it is too good for people. After the historical experiences and results of the science of man of the past 100 years, a Marxist can no longer cultivate limitless belief in man's human potential. I don't know what the science refers to, but I'm assuming that he might be referring to psychoanalysis here, because it kind of like complicates any naive picture of I don't know, I guess like human goodness or something like that. I don't know. I'm talking about that's not what I'm talking about. Man is a much more durable disposition for irrationality, for enslavement and submission, for aggressiveness and destruction than Marx had believed. Okay, I was totally right. In our century, we have been witness to the greatest explosion of human evil known to man. Of course, it does not necessarily follow from this that human nature is now worse than it was before. Perhaps contemporary man is even better. Only he has at his disposal incomparably more terrible means of inflicting evil. Philosophy must reserve a place for inhumanity. If we would rather speak more optimistically, we must say that apparently philosophy can reasonably anticipate only relative, but never absolute humanization. But let there be no misunderstanding. I am not reproaching Marx for constructing utopia in the sense of a vision of a non-existent form of social organization. Without such anticipation, there could be no decisive transcendence of historical factuality, but only stagnation within historical factuality. Utopia, in this sense, represents a legitimate dimension of Marx's radical critical theory of society and history. Such utopia is an inherent aspect of his revolutionary dialectic. It is for this reason that opportunistic theoreticians in the workers' movement have usually come out against both the dialectic and utopia in Marx. It is characteristic for conservatives to disqualify all that is new and untried as utopian. The politics of piecemeal reform of the existing order has a similar aversion to utopias. Yet utopias have often disclosed undreamed-of human potentials, on the basis of which people have committed themselves to struggle for a more beautiful future. Someone once put it well, quote, "The community which rejects its utopians today will encounter moral anemia tomorrow," end quote. I don't know who said that. Maybe Oscar Wilde? I don't know. I don't know why I feel like that's Oscar Wilde. My gut tells me it is. My woman's intuition. Marx, however, occasionally described the net non-existent form of social organization, communism, as a perfect state. Then we are no longer talking simply about utopias, but rather about absolute utopia, which finds support in the human situation for unlimited hope, in the transcendence of all the fundamental existential contradictions of man. If this in fact were to come about, the human and social situation would be transformed into a sort of, quote, perpetuum immobile, end quote. Thus the realization of such a utopia would not be desirable even if that utopia were possible. We must free ourselves of the illusion that Marx was a theorist of purely scientific as opposed to utopian communism. The difference between these two types of communism is much more relative than it seemed to the classics of Marxism, particularly to Engels in his work Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. However, notwithstanding its occasional absolutization, Marx's ideal of communism is also based upon the awareness of some real possibilities of humanization, a society without exploitation, class, racial, and other discriminations, a society without war, a self-governing community which dispossesses of material and cultural abundance, which disposes of material and cultural abundance, associated humanity, and so on. Section 4. Adherents of Marx's conception of alienation ought to take greater account of its terminological evolution. One cannot so easily gloss over the fact that in his later works, Marx did not, as a rule, use the term, quote, alienation. As early as the German ideology, Marx self-critically mentioned, quote, alienation, quote, human essence, quote, generic being, end quote, and, quote, human nature, end quote. In the manifesto of the Communist Party, he wrote, quote, the German literati reversed this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic foundations of society, they wrote, quote, alienation of humanity, end quote, end quote. Communist Manifesto. True, quote, human nature, end quote, appears again in capital in two senses, as general and as historic nature. It seems that the simultaneous recognition of certain essential and at the same time dynamic elements in the structure of human nature is one of the peculiar characteristics of Marxism, but it is not at all necessary to connect the concepts of human essence and human nature with the category of alienation or de-alienation, or vice versa, since we have seen one thereby falls into needless difficulties. Alienation and de-alienation are concepts which for Marx imply respectively enslavement, freedom, destructiveness, creativity, egoism, sociability, and so on. Footnote: the nature of language in its own way is responsible for the absolutization of the future. When, for instance, we oppose the free man of the communist future to an enslaved man, we lose sight of the relative nature of these concepts. Thus, in the spirit of the Marxian dialectic, one ought to speak of emancipation, socialization, and de-alienation, rather than a free, socialized, and de-alienated man, since these are only the ideal limits of the former processes. End footnote. These human potentials ought to be liberated from the terminological framework of, quote, alienation and, quote, de-alienation, and the latter concepts defined anew proceeding from the narrower and more acceptable sense found in the writings of Marx. Quote, alienation and, quote, de-alienation would then continue to designate important phenomena, but would no longer encounter the difficulties which have been described in earlier sections of this chapter. All the aforementioned essential potentials of man, together with alienation and de-alienation, redefined, of course, ought to be synthesized into the category of dehumanization and humanization. For a narrower sense of alienation in Marx's work, we might rely upon the concept of the alienation of labor and of the products of labor. Quote, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him, end quote. German ideology. Quote, with the increasing mass of objects, therefore, the realm of alien entities to which man is subjected also increases. Every new product is a new potentiality of mutual deceit and robbery, end quote. Quote, the worker puts his life into the object, and his life then belongs no longer to himself but to the object, ... The alienation of the worker. The alienation of the worker is in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, assumes an external existence, but that it exists independently, outside himself, and alien to him, and that it stands opposed to him as an autonomous power. The life which he has given to the object sets itself against him as an alien power and hostile force. End quote. Quote, the crystallization of social activity, this consolidation of what we ourselves produce into an objective power above us, growing out of our control, thwarting our expectations, bringing to naught our calculations, is one of the chief factors in historical development up to now. End quote. Marx, the German ideology. Section 5. The term, quote, alienation, quote, ought to apply to a particular kind of relationship between man, on the one hand, and man's activity and creations on the other. We can locate this relationship on a continuum which begins with the state in which man loses control over his activity and creations. Further, man's activity and creations can assume a position of domination over him. He becomes dependent upon them and even begins to serve them. Finally, they can enslave, terrorize, threaten, and even destroy him. Quote, activity here refers to all types of human mental and physical activity. And quote, creations is used in the broadest sense of the word, corresponding to the connotation which we have given to quote, activity. Thus, for instance, it can embrace things, organizations, institutions, ideas, scientific and artistic works, linguistic creations, and myths. The terms quote, activity and quote, creations enable us to embrace a good deal more than is embraced by the concept of alienation, of labor, and of the products of labor, the alienation of the state and other political institutions, ideological alienation, and so on. Activity can become alienated from man in two ways. First, if the activity is not freely chosen by man but rather compelled, both the goal of his activity and the conditions under which he performs his activity are imposed upon him. In Marxist terms, this is not, quote, self-activity, end quote. Second, the entire personality becomes a slave to one of its activities, as for instance in the attempt to secure one's material existence. Instead of leading to the self-affirmation of man, such activity comes to dominate man. In both cases, man is more of a mere creature than a real creator. Alienation, thus defined, has, as in Marx, the status of a philosophical concept which transcends the separate spheres of human life and individual sciences. The meaning of quote, alienation suggested here could be operationalized for use in concrete scientific research. Nevertheless, it is neither here nor in Marx a purely cognitive concept. It is a normative critical concept as well. Moreover, both here and in Marx, it presupposes a humanistic philosophy, which asserts that man ought to have control over his own activity and creations, and which evaluates any contrary state negatively. Alienation as defined here does not in itself imply the possibility that man can change such a state. In the second section of this chapter, we discuss the difficulties in which Marx's definition of alienation finds itself because of the category of possibility. Our definition, however, makes it possible to distinguish between two matters. First, the ascertainment of alienation, and second, the judgment that man ought to change that state. Only at this point can we presume the real possibility that he can do this. In Marx's spirit, we must further differentiate among alienation, consciousness of alienation, and one's attitude toward alienation. A person's activity and creations may indeed be alienated from him without his being conscious of it, whether he simply never was aware of it or whether this awareness is suppressed in his subconscious. Man can be so unconscious of his alienation that he simply does not know that a given entity is his creation. He may even see himself as a creation of that entity, as for instance in religion. This is the height of what we may call, again inspired by Marx, the fetishism of human creations. There are real possibilities that certain forms of alienation, for example, the alienation of labor and of the products of labor, may be transcended. Today, however, we cannot believe in the possibility of the complete and definitive de-alienation which Marx projected into the communist future. The possibility for man's activity and creations to become alienated will always exist. The causes of alienation are very diverse. In this respect, nothing can be said a priori. Not even that behind the alienation of the activity and the creations of some people, there are always others who control, enslave, and threaten them, even though history is replete with the domination of individuals and groups over the creation activities of others. One can, for instance, fall on one's knees before a god without simultaneously subjugating oneself even indirectly to another man. Marx expected that all alienation would cease with the supersession of private property. Quote, the positive supersession of private property, as the appropriation of human life, is therefore the positive supersession of all alienation. End quote. Marx. But some contemporary Marxists do not accept such passages. For some of them, for example, religion has deep and varied roots, and it is naive to believe that it will disappear with a change in the form of property, however durable and radical. Some critics, on the other hand, believe that the renewal of economic and political alienation in socialism is in itself conclusive proof against Marx. The usual response to this is that Marx, in fact, never spoke of the simple supersession, but only of the, quote, positive supersession, unquote, in the Hegelian sense of private property, and that this is consistent with the spirit of his understanding of socialism as a prolonged transitional period. However, this answer is no more than a partial way out of the difficulty. I think that we can safely take Marx's quote, positive supersession of private property to mean socialization of property. The participation of the working masses in the socialist revolution itself represents the beginning of de-alienation and the first step towards a social organization which will represent the, quote, associated force of individuals, unquote. The revolutionary state serves as the initial lever of this de-alienation. The expropriation of private property which it accomplishes constitutes only the initial phase of the socialization of ownership. Thus, the existence of alienation in the form of monopoly of the revolutionary state over management of production, distribution, and the society as a whole is not in itself proof against Marx's anticipation of definitive de-alienation after the, quote, positive supersession of private property. This Janus-faced socialist state, both de-alienating and alienating, has been adequately portrayed by contemporary Marxists. Yet unfortunately, not even the severest critics among them have gone far enough in drawing the theoretical boundary between the socialist and the Stalinist state, the boundary which is a precondition for destroying the statist myth of socialism. They see the Stalinist state has lost its de-alienating character, that it has become the source of a new and terrible alienation, but they still fail to reject its claim to a socialist character. But when alienation reaches such proportions, it is possible, in my opinion, to speak only of statism, not of socialism, in the Marxist sense of the term. It has turned out that the place of private property can be taken not only by social property, but also by the form of class property, statist property, and along with it a new mode of economic political alienation, no longer in socialism, but rather in statism. Marx remains the greatest critic of alienation in the society of private property and commodity production. It is up to contemporary Marxists to make good use of his ideas in order to discover and criticize alienation in socialism and statism. Students of alienation still feel a compulsion to devote their primary attention, as did Marx, to the production of material goods and its influence on the totality of alienation in society. Even in the most advanced countries, social and individual life has not ceased to revolve around the procurement of material existence. But today, the greatest and most important form of alienation is encountered not in the production of means of life, but rather of means to death. We all witnessed a super-alienation. Human creations are now revolving around the earth, threatening not only individuals or classes, but humanity as a whole. The apocalyptic, quote, revolt of things, end quote, against their creator. The anthropological form of the Last Judgment is in sight. A cynic might say that the definitive disappearance of alienation may coincide with its irreversible triumph. That's the end of the piece of this chapter. Thanks for listening. The next chapter is titled, and it's the first chapter in part 2 of the book, titled The Epochal Dilemma, and the chapter is titled The Statist Myth of Socialism. Thanks for listening.